Olis! Welcome to another monthly recap. It is now May, so I'm here to talk about all the books that I read in April. In the March recap, I talked about how hard of a struggle I was having with finishing a physical book. I only read 5 books in March, and then technically I only read 5 books in April, but it is May 2nd, and in the past few days I've finished a couple more books. So I am gonna include them in this recap. I don't know if that's cheating or not. Whatever, like these fake rules that I'm making up in my mind. I think it's fine. So instead of going chronologically this time, I think I'm gonna go in order of like my least favorite to my most favorite this month, just to change it up. So I'm gonna start off actually with the only romance book that I read this month, and it was an audiobook. Most of the books this month are going to be audiobooks because I was struggling through my main physical read this month for a large portion of the month, and then once I finally got through it, I decided to start a trilogy, and that was my other physical read, so that was also quite an endeavor. So I only have 2 physical books and the rest of them were audiobooks, and I was kind of going through it last month and this month, so after a few really tough reads I decided to just go for something light and fun and something to like take the weight off. So I read the 3rd book in the I always forget the name of the series. Rebel Blue Ranch. Yes. The 3rd book in the Rebel Blue Ranch series by Lila Sage. And this is like series in quotes because it's a romance series, you know, like they're standalones, but it's in the same town, same cast of characters, and you get like little cameos from characters that you know from the other books in the series. So I've read her first 2 books over the past few years. Lost and Lassoed, I think is no, that was this one. Done and Dusted, Swift and Saddled, I believe, and then this one is Lost and Lassoed. I don't know, the names kind of don't mean anything, so I get confused with which one's which. But anyway, yeah, this was Lost and Lassoed, 3rd book in the series, and this one follows Gus and Teddy, who we were introduced to from the very first book, and we kind of knew that eventually we would get their story, and this is us finally getting that, and yeah, it was good. It was fine, it was serviceable, it was definitely what I was needing and in the mood for at that time, and it delivered exactly what I was looking for, so I was very thankful for Lila Sage for that. So the Rebel Blue Ranch series as a whole follows this family of ranchers, cowboys. I don't know. I'm not a big like cowboy romance person. I mean, I'm like barely a romance person, but this was my first foray into cowboy romances. I don't even know if you would consider this that, because I think it kind of, I don't know that genre at all. Let me know if you are into cowboy romances. Like, is this firmly in that category? I'm not sure. But we follow in each book a different sibling in the Ryder family. The first one follows Emmy, who is like the only sister of the siblings. The second one follows one of the brothers, and then this 3rd one follows the oldest of the brothers, Gus, and his romance with Emmy's childhood best friend, Teddy. So Gus and Teddy, they're kind of like frenemies. They hate each other, but are like family basically because she's known the Ryder family her whole life. She's been best friends with Emmy for a long time. Why are they enemies? Unclear. The explanation that we get is basically like Gus doesn't like Teddy because she's been a bad influence on his sister Emmy, because she's kind of like this wild child, always getting in trouble and stuff. So he's like, I don't like Teddy because she's so rebellious and she's a bad influence on Emmy. And then we get hints throughout the book that like there was something that happened 7 years ago or whatever, and we haven't talked about it since. It's like not a big deal. I think, you know, enemies to lovers is just kind of like the most loved trope for a romance, so this was kind of that, but like, and this is a problem that I have with like just in general, romances that are contemporary, that are supposed to be enemies to lovers. I'm like, I just don't believe that y'all are enemies. Like, people in real life don't have enemies. It's more like, you're hot, but I find you annoying, but I find you hot, and that's the trope, really. But, you know, whatever. Anyway, the main premise and like the story setup for this is that Gus is a single father. His baby mama, she's like very involved. They're still good friends. They co-parent, but they were never like a true couple. They just kind of like hooked up, had a baby by accident, and then it's been 7 years, so he has a 7-year-old daughter. And this summer, his co-parent, she has to be in, I believe, New York or something for school, question mark. I kind of already forgot, but she has to be away for the summer, basically. And he has to be a single dad for a summer, God forbid. He has to take care of his child on his own. And he's also like the main person in the family who runs the ranch. He is kind of like the manager of all the workers on the ranch, so he also has to take care of that. And it's just a lot for him. He's feeling overwhelmed, but you know, typical man masculinity problem. He doesn't want to admit that he needs help. That's kind of like what he's going through. At the same time, Teddy just lost her job. She works at a boutique in town. Her whole thing is like fashion, and she was working at this like vintage clothing store boutique, and it's closing down, so she lost her job and she's feeling a little lost and directionless. And she's also like at a weird point with Emmy, who is her best friend and who we follow in the first book. You know, she finds her romance and now she's like in a long-term partnership, and Teddy is just feeling a little lost. She's like, Emmy was always my person, but now she's found someone and I'm not like her main person anymore. So she's feeling a little lost, lonely, directionless, and she needs a job for the summer. So Gus needs somebody to help him take care of his daughter for the summer. So you can see where the plot is going. Teddy steps in to help Gus, and it goes from there. Yeah, like I said, this was exactly what I was expecting, exactly what I wanted. There was no surprises and like nothing too major about this book. I do appreciate that Lila Sage incorporates a lot of different things and different like more serious issues with each of her books. I don't quite remember the second one. I didn't really like the second one all that much. It was kind of whatever to me. The first one I really enjoyed, and I think that one, Emmy has OCD and she's dealing with that and exploring that, and I thought that was like a really cool exploration of it that I hadn't really seen in a lot of contemporary books. This one of the main things that we explore outside of the romance is Teddy's relationship with her dad, and seeing him as he ages and starts to have like health complications and her dealing with that. And in general, like the series has a lot of really nice family dynamics, and that's nice to see and explore. As far as diversity, like there is none in this series, which is fine. Like Lila Sage, she's a white author, and it was just a little bit kind of like an alternate reality that was kind of nice to live in, where like all these people wouldn't be like right-wing psychopaths because in real life they probably would be, but in this little fictional story, like they're all really nice, compassionate people, which is just like a little treat to read. The audiobook is fine. Reading dual POVs or listening to dual POV audiobooks is sometimes a little jarring because I never know if it's going to be like a single narrator or if they're going to have different narrators for the different perspectives. And this one, it started off in Teddy's point of view, and like the narrator was a woman, she was fine. And then the second chapter was Gus's point of view, and like it was a literal jump scare when his point of view started because the man's voice was so deep, like it was like unnaturally deep, and it scared me. I was literally like, oh my god, who is this demon that just possessed me? It was scary, you guys. I was scared, but yeah, it was fine. overall. Once I got used to like his really deep voice, I was like, this is fine. Yeah, this book wasn't life-changing, but it was like a nice break. Like I said, one of the things that I hate in romances is like unwarranted nicknames. They're just unnecessary, I feel like, and I don't know, is that like a thing that a lot of people are into? Like when a man starts calling you a random nickname? Because I feel like the nickname that emerged in this story was very like unwarranted. It came out of nowhere, like before they had even crossed over from enemies to lovers. Like they were still in the enemies phase, and he was calling her baby. I was like, why? It was, yeah, I didn't like it, but there's never been a nickname that I was like, that makes sense, and I enjoyed that. Yeah, not a fan of these random nicknames in romance stories. And then the other like kind of weak thing in this book was that there was a lot of like these mini conflicts that would pop up, and then we would just kind of glaze over them and never address them again. Like, I don't know, at one point there was like this thing where they started getting physical, and Teddy was like, okay, but we can't kiss. No kissing on the mouth. That's too intimate. We can do everything else, but no kissing. And then like, I don't know, a paragraph later, we're past that point and the rule doesn't matter anymore. Which, like, if you're gonna introduce a rule, maybe draw it out and make it more of a thing. I don't know. It was just kind of like nothing. And then another thing that was kind of nothing was that at one point, one of the conflicts that they have is that he becomes kind of jealous, and Teddy is like a very outgoing, very bubbly person, and she's like flirting with a man, and Gus becomes very jealous, very possessive, and Teddy's like, well, you just kind of have to accept that about me. I'm just a flirty person. And I don't know, that seems kind of like a conflict that's not like insignificant. Like if you're a very possessive, jealous person, like that's not great. But also, I don't know, like wouldn't that cause more conflict if like the person that you're with is just naturally very bubbly and outgoing? I don't know, it was brought up, and then it was never really talked about again, which I feel like is gonna become a problem for them down the line. But I don't know, I guess that's a future them problem that we won't get to explore in this book. But yeah, overall, it's fine. It's a romance series that I enjoy because it's so straightforward. It's exactly what you expect, and you're not gonna get things thrown at you that are like too dark, too traumatic, too unexpected. So I really love having these little pockets of levity that I can tap into when I need to, and I definitely needed it this month, and it was exactly what I was looking for. Just standard romance, can't go wrong with it. There's a fourth book in the series that I am absolutely gonna save for a rainy day. And yeah, it was exactly what you would expect. I think I gave it like 3.5 stars overall, because it wasn't life-changing, but it wasn't bad by any means. So that was Lost and Lassoed by Lila Sage. Another audiobook that I read this month was Cemetery of Untold Stories by Julia Alvarez. This is a book that follows a woman named Alma. Alma is a successful novelist from the Dominican Republic, and she's kind of like in the later days of her career, and she's thinking a lot about like all of the stories that over the years she's tried to write, and for some reason or another hasn't been able to finish these stories and publish them, and they just sit in boxes forever untold, and she's kind of like trying to grapple with what to do with these stories. And then her father passes away, and her sisters learn through his will that they've inherited some property on the Dominican Republic. At this point, they're all living in the US. They've grown up in the US, but now they have these properties in the Dominican Republic, and Alma decides to claim one of the properties, and she begins turning it into a cemetery, but specifically a cemetery for all of these different stories that she never got to tell. She decides that that's how she's going to say goodbye to them, is by burying them and creating a cemetery for all of these untold stories, hence the name of the book. I would say this book is a mix of like historical fiction and magical realism, which just magical realism as a term we'll get back to when we talk about one of the other books that I read this month, but I would say that this can be clearly categorized as magical realism because it is realistic, it is contemporary, but then we also have like these elements of fantasy and mystical, magical things that are happening. So these stories, when she buries them, they kind of refuse to stay dead. Like they still want to be told. When she walks through the cemetery, she can hear all these voices of the characters in her story, like still wanting to tell their story, still wanting to be heard. So the reason why it's contemporary but also historical fiction is that because these stories are like coming alive, we also get glimpses into the characters in her stories that she never got to tell. So the narrative is not linear. We're kind of jumping back and forth perspectives and timelines, and sometimes it got a little complicated to follow because there was just a lot of characters introduced, and for like the first half of the book I was a little just not super invested in any of the individual storylines that we were being introduced to. So some of the perspectives that we're delving into besides Alma's is her father's story, because that was one of the stories that she always wanted to tell but she never got to, because her family and specifically her mother was just very like, there was a lot of shame around their specific story. And I do feel like in Latino families there's sometimes like a need, especially with like older generations, for everything to look very perfect from the surface and from the outside, and like you don't talk about your baggage, you don't talk about your trauma, you don't want people to see you as anything other than like the perfect immigrant, the perfect family. So there was some of that with Alma and her mom, and Alma just never got to tell their story, her dad's story, because her mom was like, no, like don't put that out there for the world. So that's one of the stories that Alma never got to tell. Another one is the story of Bienvenida Trujillo, I believe. She was the first wife of a dictator of the Dominican Republic, and I believe this is based on a real person, a real story, and in the book Alma wants to tell her story because she's kind of a figure that history erased and forgot about, and there's not a lot known about her. So Alma wants to like delve into that, tell her story, but she is never able to. So that's one of the stories that she buries, but we get glimpses of throughout the novel. And then we also have this woman named Filomena, who is Alma's neighbor when she moves into this property. There's this woman who lives nearby, and she comes by, and eventually Alma hires her to be like a groundskeeper for the cemetery. But you know, Filomena also has her own stories that she tells, and we get to explore throughout the novel. So eventually all of these stories kind of start blending together and intertwining, and I was just a little, like not super invested during the first half. And then there does come a point around the halfway mark where something really big happens, and then the story starts kind of picking up speed from there. And then after that point I was kind of hooked. I just think it took a little too long to get to the point where I was like really understanding why all of these stories, why we were exploring like individually all of these different stories and why I should care. It just took too long to get there, and I wish I could have become invested like a lot earlier than I did. And I don't know if that's on me or the way that the story is told. And then like even at the end, like I was invested in the story, but like the individual characters, I don't feel like I really connected with any of them like on a deeper level, but that's also just kind of like a personal thing. There wasn't like a lot of relatability to them for me, but it wasn't a bad book. I was still, you know, by the end I was like wanting to know what happens. And I think honestly Alvarez's main draw. Like, her biggest strength in the story for me was like her description of everything was very vivid and very beautiful, and like all the descriptions of everything and the way that she was writing about the Dominican Republic and about these specific characters and their stories, like it felt very authentic, like it was coming from a very real and raw place. And I do wonder if there's like some, like with the character Alma being a writer later in her career and wanting to tell these stories that she never got to fully explore and publish, like I wonder if that was kind of like Julia Alvarez. That was like some self-insert there, because Julia Alvarez is also a very successful writer who's a little bit like later in her career, and I'm sure that there's a lot of truth to this concept of like being haunted by all the stories that you never got to tell. So yeah, the writing style was great, and a lot of the things that we explore in this, like immigration and a lot of like the conflicts of the Dominican Republic, I think were really well done. And I did end up enjoying it. I just thought it took a little long for me to get invested. So I think I also gave this one 3.5 stars. And I think this is a good book if you are somebody who loves like getting some good tea about people that you don't know. But just know that this was like a story that somebody tells you where it takes them like way too long to get to the point, but by the time they do, you're like, damn, that was a crazy story. It was very juicy. I think you could have cut out a lot of the detail that was not super necessary, but I'm glad to have heard the story because it was very interesting. That's basically the vibe of this book. Okay, another audiobook that I listened to this month that was also written by a Latin American writer was Clean by Alia Trabuco Serran, and she is a Chilean writer. And this book, I listened to the English version, so this was originally written in Spanish. The Spanish audiobook was not available at my library, so I listened to it in English. This story takes place in Chile, and we are following a woman named Estela, and this is told from, okay, I get my perspectives a little confused sometimes. I think this is like a second person point of view. So Estela is like talking to us. She's telling us her story from her account. So she's like addressing us, and ostensibly the us that she's talking to is like authorities, like the police. She's being interrogated. And right from the jump, from like the first chapter of this book, we learn that Estela is being questioned for the death of this young girl. Okay, let me backtrack a little bit. Estela is a housekeeper in Chile. She's been a housekeeper for like this wealthy family for 7 years, and she is also like one of the primary caretakers of the family's daughter, who is 7 years old. So at the start of the book, we find out that this daughter, Julia, she has died, and Estela is being questioned for her death. So then throughout the story, Estela kind of takes us through her experience and her life over the past 7 years, and she's trying to convince us that she had nothing to do with this, that she's not responsible for the death of this child. So this book is very conversational because the point of view is from Estela talking to us and telling us her life. It is mostly chronological because she starts at the very beginning from when she gets hired by this family to become their housekeeper. But she does kind of digress a lot because she's like telling us a story. And so it's told in that way where like somebody's telling you a story, they're going in chronological order, but then they kind of like veer off to like different stories. So throughout the book, she kind of tells us about her childhood and her experiences growing up, and she talks a lot about her mother and her relationship with her mother. Her mom was also a housekeeper for her whole life, and we learn that even though Estela is like very unhappy in this role, and you know, she doesn't see herself doing this long term, she wants to leave, and she has stayed for 7 years. And, you know, she tells us, like, I'm sure you are asking yourselves, like, why didn't you leave? Why are you still there? And we learn that her mother is very sick, and she sends money back to her family in her hometown to take care of her mom. So she feels a little trapped. She feels like she can't leave because she has to make money to take care of her mom. The book overall, it's pretty short, pretty straightforward, and I would say that like the main theme of the book is exploration of class inequality. Being in Estela's point of view is very bleak, and yeah, like the main thing explored is the dynamic between her and her employers, and just the way that they treat her and the way that the child treats her as well. Like this child who is being raised with basically an employee as a caretaker, like the strange dynamic that exists there, and just like the privilege of this child. But then also, like, you know, we also see a lot of like the struggles of this 7-year-old girl who is being raised primarily by her nanny, and then her parents are kind of secondary characters in her life. Like they love her and they take care of her, but she's never truly like seen or acknowledged or like really treated like a person with agency. Yeah, overall just kind of a very bleak book. And in the background of the story is also like little glimpses into Chile and some of the political and social unrest that's going on there. Apparently there were like really big nationwide protests around 2019, 2020, and like the main driving factor for those protests was just like the social inequality that Chile has been experiencing. So we have that in the background, and then it kind of parallels everything that Estela is going through in like her personal life. The themes that are explored in this, they're not very clearly spelled out. Like you kind of have to interpolate them from the story that Estela is telling us. And then I also thought the way the story wrapped up wasn't the most satisfying, and because we're only getting Estela's point of view, and because her life is so repetitive and mundane and she's kind of recounting like her day-to-day, it does get a little bit just dull and slow. But I think it's meant to feel that way because you're meant to really kind of empathize with Estela and be in her shoes and experience her day-to-day life like she did. But yeah, it was just a little slow, but there's always like the underlying tension of the death of this child. You know it's coming and you're kind of building up to it. And like even throughout the story, Estela is telling us like, oh, are you bored? Am I boring you? Is my life too bleak and sad for you? Like, well, this was what my life was. I'm sorry. So yeah, it's self-aware in that way, but it is kind of like, I don't know, there are some points where you're like, okay, like let's get to the point. But you know, I think it's meant to make you understand what it's like to be in this position of subordination and just, yeah, sit in and really feel like that class and social dynamic that Estela feels. So yeah, this was an interesting one. I think I gave it 4 stars. Looking back on it, I probably would bring it down to like 3.5 stars. It was interesting, but it was a little slow, and the conclusion wasn't like the most satisfying for me, but I think it was a interesting one for sure. That was Clean by Alia Trabuco Serán. Another audiobook that I listened to this month, and I think it was the only nonfiction audiobook, was Magical Realism by Vanessa Angelica Villarreal. And this is an essay collection that's like part memoir, part social commentary. Vanessa Angelica Villarreal is a Mexican-American writer. She was born in the Rio Grande Valley, so she's a fellow border town 956 girl like me. And in this memoir, she's talking a lot about being born on the border, growing up in Texas. I think she lived on the border for a few years, but then her family moved to Houston, so most of her childhood and adolescence was in Houston. So yeah, from the very beginning of this book, I really connected connected with Vanessa and I could relate to her a lot, so I was really enjoying this book. And I listened to all of it in audiobook format, but I did go out and buy a physical copy of it because I was enjoying it so much and I wanted to annotate it. So I bought the physical book, so this is it. It also is just so beautiful. Like, this is one of my favorite covers of a book ever. Look at it. It's gorgeous. So it's called Magical Realism, Essays on Music, Memory, Fantasy, and Borders. So, oh, and it's also a signed copy. Yeah, I went to go get it at Book People, and yeah, they just had signed copies. So I was like, that's cool. So yeah, this is an essay collection. It's very much told in like a fragmented, non-linear way. It's not like just a straight up chronological memoir. Vanessa is interspersing like stories of her life with like pop culture commentary. And one of the things that she talks a lot about in this memoir is fantasy and how she has used different elements of fantasy and magical thinking, and she calls it fabulation. So like coming up with stories to like explain things that have gone unexplained in your life or in history. So she talks a lot about how fantasy has helped her deal with trauma, and as people, as mestizos, as indigenous people, as colonized people, we can kind of like see that from like a more universal point of view, that we have also used fantasy and fabulation as a way to deal with trauma and as a way to rewrite our own history that has been taken from us through colonization. So this is just a very cool exploration. She talks a lot about like her own personal things that she's gone through. So like in her childhood, she talks about growing up and going to like a primarily white school, and how just because of her race and skin color, she was seen as somebody who wouldn't amount to the same things that her white peers would. So she was kind of written off and categorized as like a problem child, and she talks about like how that categorization and that perspective eventually like just led her down that path because she was told that that's what her life would amount to. So she was just basically following the path that was laid out for her. So I thought that was interesting because it made me really think about how growing up in a border town where like 95% of the people are Mexican American, that was not my experience. I never felt othered. I never felt racialized or stereotyped against. And, you know, I feel like my life, because like our backgrounds and childhood paralleled so much until she moves to Houston and then starts having these experiences, I feel like my life could have been so different if I had grown up anywhere else where I was a minority. So yeah, it just made me reflect on the similarities and then how our paths kind of diverged, and how just the way that people see you and categorize you and stereotype you can really have an effect on what you believe about yourself. Another element that's really prominent here, and that was a big part of her life, is music. And there was a cool chapter that I really appreciated where she's talking about two big artists that were a part of her development through like her teenage years and then like early adulthood were Selena and Nirvana, and she kind of talks about like what roles those two individual musical artists played in her life, and I really liked that section. She talks a lot about how Nirvana kind of like was another one of the pop culture elements that helped her like work through her own trauma and understand herself and the turmoil in her life a lot better, which like I really related to as somebody who was as like an early 2000s child. I had a punk rock emo phase, and like it seems silly, but like I was recently, before I even started this book, reflecting on like how much Green Day, kind of how I grew up with Green Day, and like even without understanding, like they really helped develop like a lot of my worldview. And I was just like jokingly like saying like Green Day radicalized me at like 10 years old, and it's kind of a joke, but it's kind of true. So she talks a lot lot about how like Nirvana helped her see a different perspective and a different point of view of the world that she didn't know was possible. But I really liked the section also about Selena and how Selena is idolized as a Mexican American icon, and she is, but also we don't really talk about how she was very conservative. She came from a very conservative family. Religion and gender roles and misogyny, like they all played a big role in who she was. And you know, she's kind of touted as like a feminist Mexican American icon, but like in reality, when she was alive, she was very much playing into like these stereotypical gender roles. So Vanessa talks about how when she was growing up, Selena was kind of like the epitome of like what was expected of her as a Mexican American woman. So she's kind of like comparing and contrasting these roles that like Selena versus Nirvana had on her. And I just found that section very interesting because I'm back. My camera died and the lighting changed, so now maybe it might look a little different. I apologize for that. Just let's all pretend like we don't notice the continuity errors. But yeah, I'm back. I think we were talking about magical realism, right? I think I was talking about Selena, the essay about Selena and Nirvana, and how Vanessa is comparing and contrasting what those two musical artists helped her realize about herself and helped her work through in her life. And yeah, I really enjoyed that kind of like praise but also critique for Selena, that I feel like because she died at such a young age and because she's such an icon and because she did do a lot to like bring attention and recognition to Tejano music, and because she was a woman in Tejano music, like those are big accomplishments. She did a lot for the Latino community, but at the same time, like she wasn't perfect. And you know, in a 2025 lens, looking back on the Selena of the 90s and what she believed and represented and stood for, there are things that we can critique. And I think the way that Vanessa did it was really, really smart and thought-provoking, and I enjoyed it a lot. And then there's a lot that she covers. It's not like a super long memoir, but she talks about a lot of different things, and it's structured in like a semi-chronological way, but also a lot of the essays, they're structured around like a central thesis, but it's not one cohesive essay. It's like some of them have like a lot of smaller mini sections within them. They're kind of just like a collage of thoughts on one topic. And another thing that she talks a lot about here is fantasy. She talks about the different fantasy series that she's into and how she never expected to be a person who was into fantasy, but once she started getting into it, how even though she probably isn't the target audience or the audience that creators of fantasy have in mind when they're making their stories, their video games, their books, she was able to still relate to them and find a lot of meaning and connect them to her life in different ways and use them to help her through some of her trauma. And one of my favorite essays, and I feel like kind of the central topic of the book, was the one where she talks about magical realism, and it just made me think about fantasy versus magical realism. It's something that like I've been thinking about for a long time, like ever since I started picking up my reading and like trying to do reviews and recaps and trying to categorize books into certain genres or whatever. It's helpful when you're making recommendations, when you're at a bookstore, when you're trying to figure out what you like and what you want to read. Genres are helpful and necessary in a lot of ways, but in a lot of ways they can also be very limiting and detrimental, and especially for authors that are part of a marginalized group or who are trying to write books as social commentary. Sometimes genres can be stereotyping. They can be used to like lump a certain demographic together, which is something that happens with Latino writers and being lumped into magical realism under that category. So that's something that she explores here, like what is magical realism? How does it differ from traditional fantasy, and why do all Latino speculative fiction stories get labeled as magical realism. So she goes into that, and I really enjoyed her description of fantasy as kind of like the colonizer point of view, where you're creating a world, you're building the world from scratch, you get to make all the rules, you get to play God, you are writing the history for the world that you're creating, and then contrasting that to magical realism as a point of view of the oppressed, a point of view of the global south, because you are using speculative elements to describe something that is happening in our normal everyday world, but that can't be described and is sometimes the root of trauma, the root of pain, and you're trying to explore that in a way that makes sense, and the only way that you can come up with an explanation for that is through fantasy or like fantastical elements in an otherwise normal world. She explains it a lot better. It makes a lot more sense in her essays, so I just recommend this book to anybody who might be interested in that. This was a really good book. I related to a lot of things that Vanessa, a fellow border town girl, was talking about here, so this memoir is really, really good. I listened to it, she narrates it. Audiobook was really good, but I just wanted to have my own copy to annotate it. So yeah, that was magical realism. So the other book that I read this month that I think pairs really well with magical realism, because we're talking about the colonization of the global south, is The Open Veins of Latin America. I talked about this in my last vlog, or maybe the one before that, just about how long it took me to get through this book. It was a month-long endeavor for me, and part of the reason why is because I decided to read it in Spanish, because it was originally written in Spanish by Eduardo Galeano, who is a author from Uruguay. He wrote this in the 60s, and the original was in Spanish. I checked it out from my library in Spanish, and I was just having a hard time reading it. Like, I understood it for the most part, but also like the flow of reading was interrupted like every few paragraphs when I had to like look up a word that I hadn't heard before. And because this is a nonfiction, and because it's for the most part talking about economic concepts, which are not my strong suit, especially when a lot of the terms are in Spanish, it took me a while to read. But I got through it, and I'm very, very glad that I did. And I thought that it was so good and so informative and so important that I just went ahead and bought myself a copy, this one in English, so I can go back to it and refer to it and just understand it a lot easier. But I am proud of myself for getting through it and like understanding it for the most part in Spanish. But anyway, this book is a nonfiction historical book written in the 60s, like I said, and this book is covering a lot of ground. It's not a terribly long book. Like, by the looks of it, like, it is surprising that it took me an entire month to read, but the history and everything that Eduardo Galeano is trying to tackle in this book is very, very vast. He's basically recounting the entire history of Latin America as a region, from the time when it was first colonized by European settlers all the way up to the present day when this was written, which was like late 60s, almost 1970. And he's talking about how Latin America was settled and colonized and exploited for all its natural resources, and how because of that it has never been able to catch up to the global north as far as economic progress. So he's recounting exactly what happened in those early days of conquest, and just how badly all Latin American countries were plundered and exploited. And then he moves on to how once European countries were able to establish themselves and industrialize their countries. Pepper is being crazy. If you hear background noise, that's Pepper just rolling around. She's on one right now. But Latin American countries Latin American countries were kind of dependent on their trade agreements with Europe. Latin American countries have always been the source of a lot of natural resources for the global north, and due to many factors that Eduardo Galeano explores in here, they have just been exploited and unable to break these patterns, these cycles of economic abuse from the empires, which are Europe and then eventually the United States. And I thought it was very interesting how he talks about the concept of, and I guess it's like a very basic concept, I just had never heard of it before. My economic literacy is unfortunately very low, but you know, I'm trying to understand things better, especially like in this world that we're living in today, where like everybody's talking about tariffs and free trade, and you know, my head is spinning trying to understand. But he talks about this concept of the natural resource curse, and he does so like in a very sad and heartbreaking way, where he's talking about Latin America being rich in natural resources, being rich in soil that's prime for agriculture, being rich in minerals and gold and silver and petroleum, and that being its downfall because those are all the things that Europe was exploiting, and those are the things that then made Latin American countries dependent on their economic agreements with those countries, and then it just kept them in this system and this cycle of not being able to advance or industrialize. Yeah, the countries that have the natural resources are the ones that never get to see the benefits or the profit from any of that. So yeah, this was a very heavy and a very dense book, but I definitely am glad to have read it. I think this gives me a much better understanding of Latin America as a whole, and it's not comprehensive by any means. I mean, this was written in the 70s. Obviously, a lot has happened since then, but I think the basis of this and this as a foundation very much still stands and still is true. Those patterns haven't been broken. So I definitely recommend this to anybody who's trying to understand the global economics, or you know, smaller scale Latin American economics in any way, or just like Latin American politics in general. I will say, if you are like me and aren't super well versed in economic policy and things like that, there is a creator who read this for his community book club and made videos talking about each section in this book and breaking it down and talking about all the important points that Eduardo Galeano makes, and also how they relate to like more modern day history and policy. And I really enjoyed those videos, and they helped me like reflect and digest on this book as I was going through it. So I definitely recommend him if you are just wanting to like understand this a little better. His channel name is Champagne Anarchism, and his videos are just incredibly helpful and incredibly easy to follow, and just helped me understand this book a lot better. So shout out to him and his videos. They really enhanced my reading experience, so I'm just giving him a little shout out. They helped me get through this. But yeah, those were my two nonfiction books. This one was one of my only physical reads this month because it took me a long time to read and digest, and it was bleak and dark but important, and I do recommend. Okay, we are nearing the end, and I've got one more audiobook and one more physical book to talk about. The last audiobook that I'm going to talk about from last month is called Medea me canto un corrido by Dalia de la Cerda. It is a book written in Spanish, and unless I'm mistaken, I'll double check, but I don't think a translation has been published for this book yet, so right now it's only out in Spanish. But I guess if you directly translate the title in English, it would be called Medea sang me a corrido, which a corrido is a type of song in Spanish, and corridos are mostly sung in the genres of like regional Mexican music, and nowadays they are very much associated with narco culture because corridos typically tell a story about an important person, an important event, and now corridos bélicos are kind of like the thing, the big popular genre in Mexico. Like even people who are not associated, not involved in narco culture at all are really into corridos bélicos, and you know, they tell the story about all these different figures in cartel culture. So yeah, that's just a background on what corridos are. But yeah, Medea sang me a corrido. This book is a collection of short stories. I listened to the audiobook, and each of the short stories was narrated by a different voice actor, and it was so good. All of these voice actors were amazing. I believe it won an Audie award, which is like the big award for audiobooks, and I think it was definitely deserved. If you speak Spanish, I would definitely recommend listening to this book or reading it. But yeah, this was a collection of stories that are all also somewhat intertwined. It takes place in a fictional city of Aztlán, which we're not told directly, but just by the description, and by Dalia de la Cerda being from Mexico, and just all of the things that are going on in this town, we can deduce that, you know, it's very much inspired by Mexico. So all of the different narrators in this collection are from the same small town in Aztlán, and they are all in one way or another very affected by organized crime and all of its different effects on small cities in Mexico, or in Aztlán in this case, like violence, poverty, the militarization of the police, and just narco culture in general. All of the stories and the way that Dalia de la Cerda writes are just very raw and real, and they feel just very authentic. Like you can tell that Dalia de la Cerda is somebody who has seen this stuff like up close and personal. I think there's like a total of 7 different protagonists and 7 different stories, and all of them except for one are women, and all of the women in these stories are not directly themselves involved in any of the cartel crime or lifestyle, but they're all still like somehow affected by it. So we just are looking at all the different ways in which they are. We are looking at poverty, at violence, at abuse, at motherhood, at abortion. There's really like a lot of different things that Dalia de la Cerda talks about, and in each of these stories we also encounter the goddess Medea, who at one point or another crosses paths with these narrators and helps them work through some of the things that they're going through. Medea is kind of like this meeting point between the physical world and the spiritual world, so she's there when that line is kind of blurring. And then we also get to hear about Medea's story and why it is that she relates so much of what's happening in this town full of poverty and violence, how she connects that with like things that have happened to her and like the myth of her story. Yeah, I thought this audiobook was incredible. It was very short, but it's very powerful, and it left me feeling like very heavy and like very impacted. But I definitely thought it was a very good one, and I want to read more of Dalia de la Cerda. I think her most well-known novel is Perros de Reserva, which does have a translation. It's Reservoir Bitches, and I've been hearing a lot about it because I think the translation came out not too long ago, so more people have been reading that and really enjoying and recommending that, so I definitely want to give that one a read sometime soon as well. But yeah, I definitely loved that one, gave it 5 stars, so good. Okay, and now we have reached the final book that I actually just finished a few days ago. My only other physical book for the month was The Poppy War. I finally read it, finally diving into R.F. Kuang's original trilogy. This was, I think, the first books that she published was the 3 Poppy War books, and I had just never dived into them. I've read Yellowface, I've read Babel, Those are both some of my favorites. They're incredible. So I knew that the Poppy War was not going to disappoint, and it didn't, but it also managed to like shock me in ways that I was not expecting. R.F. Kuang, girl, are you okay? Before I dive into it, can we take a moment to appreciate this beautiful special edition of this book? It is incredible. Look at that. Gorgeous. I wasn't sure if I wanted to tab it because I didn't want to ruin like this beautiful sprayed edge illusion, but it had to be done. I tried to do it in a little more subtle way, but yeah, look at her. She's beautiful. The dust cover is gorgeous, and then it also has these illustrations on front and the back covers. It has very pretty cover, and every chapter has an illustration, which I didn't realize before I started reading this. And they're all so beautiful. Yeah, there's one for every chapter, and they're all really, really cool. So this special edition is beautiful. But okay, the Poppy War. Whew, where do I even begin with this book? Our protagonist for the Poppy War is Rin. She is a teenager from the fictional country of Nicara. She is from a poor province in this country, and she is an orphan with adoptive parents. She was orphaned by the war. In this world, there's been two big wars, the first Poppy War and the second Poppy War. And we're not told a lot of details because Rin herself doesn't know, but she lost her parents to the Second War, and as a result she was adopted by these two drug smugglers, and she grew up very poor and forced to work for her adoptive parents. And when she's 14, she is informed by her adoptive parents that they have arranged a marriage for her to basically be sold to this man who's like more than twice her age, because it's basically like a business deal between her and her adoptive parents. And obviously she doesn't want this, and she's like, absolutely not. And the only way that she sees as a possible escape for this is to study and take a placement exam to be admitted into Sinigard, which is the country's prestige military school. So she takes it upon herself, with the help of a mentor, to study really hard to try to get into this college. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that she gets in. I think you can find that out in the synopsis of the book. But yeah, we follow her as she's adjusting to this new world, this new school that's very intense. She gets there and she realizes, you know, how much privilege a lot of these people that make it to the school have. They're kids who are like sons and daughters of political leaders, of warlords, of military personnel who basically have been trained their entire lives and raised to go to Sinigard and to become high-ranking officials of the Nicara military. So a lot of the book is exploring how much harder Rin has to work to be on the level as a lot of her peers, and just a lot of like the prejudice that she experiences being from the South and coming from poverty, and also just for being a girl and for the color of her skin. And she does get bullied for a lot of that, so we're just exploring that. And then in the background of all of this and Rin going through her life as a Sinigard student, there is kind of like underlying tensions going on with Nicara, and R.F. Kuang did write this as basically as a retelling of the China-Japanese War in the 1930s or during World War II and all of the political conflict that was going on there. I am not familiar with China's history, so I picked up on Nicara being basically a stand-in for China, and the Federation of Mugen being a stand-in for Japan, and then I think that makes beer in the book Taiwan, if I'm not mistaken, just based on like geography and like some of the things culturally and some of the like history behind the places that R.F. Kuang is describing here. But after reading this, I did do like a little bit of research on that Chinese-Japanese war, and it sounds like it's basically like a beat by beat retelling of that, plus like added elements of fantasy. But as the tensions between Niigata and the Federation are ramping up in the Poppy War, things get really, really graphic and bleak and dark, and like R.F. Kuang does not pull any punches. In the first few chapters of the book, I was kind of thinking that it was reading like a YA fantasy. I was enjoying it a lot, but it was like kind of following the format of a YA fantasy series, and Rin, the protagonist, being a teenager. But then it got really, really dark. And really, really intense, but in a good way. Like, I was really invested in Rin and some of the side characters. I think Rebecca does a really good job of developing multi-layered characters, and like her other books, taking a story, adding some fantastical elements, but really at the root of everything is a commentary on social issues, on historical issues, and this one specifically is talking about war and how horrible and dehumanizing and traumatic the realities of war are. And yeah, it was very, very heavy, but very, very good. Rebecca, you are incredible. And this was an outstanding debut novel. Like, I can't believe, how old was she when she wrote this? She was like 23 or something. My girl is talented. My girl is a genius. Yeah, this was beyond my expectations. Yeah, it got very, very dark, very, very bleak, but I am invested. I am interested in the sequel and the third book, and I honestly can't wait to read those. But I am gonna give myself like a little bit of a break because it ended like on a very bleak note, honestly. So yeah, I just know book 2 is gonna pick up on a very intense page. So yeah, we'll see how that goes, but so far, so interesting. Such a good book. Compared to Yellowface and Babel, like, you can tell that this is an earlier version of R.F. Kuang. It's not as polished, and it does feel like a debut novel, but like in a way where you know that this author is just gonna get better and better, and does. I guess because it is basically a retelling, and even though it is fantasy, it also is like historical fiction. You know, there's not a lot of female characters in this. Rin is basically the only one that is really like thoroughly explored, and some of the side characters that are developed are all men. So that's like my only complaint. Hopefully in some of the other books in this trilogy, we do get to see some of the more secondary female characters a little more explored and developed, but that was kind of like the only thing I was missing in this one. There are some things that are like very intense that, well, basically like one thing that is very intense and happens very quickly kind of early on in the book that I was like, oh, wait, are we gonna explore that a little more, or are we just gonna like gloss past that? And we kind of just like breezed on through something that I feel like could have used a little bit more care and exploration, because it happens in a few paragraphs and then we're kind of like done with and never talk about it again, which I thought was interesting. I won't spoil anything. It really, I don't know, so far in this book hasn't been brought up truly in like a way where we're thinking about it and exploring it more deeply, but like maybe it'll play a factor in some of the later books. I'm not sure. There was something that was kind of wild to me, but then we get further on in the story and even more wild, very horrible things happen. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not a big deal, but yeah, that was just like one of the only things that stood out to me as kind of strange. But something that I love about R.F. Kuang is that she incorporates a lot of like historical inspirations in her books, and Chinese history I think is one of the areas of expertise for R.F. Kuang. I believe she either like got her degree in that or like is getting her PhD in Chinese studies, so you know, it makes sense that she's so well versed in all of this, and I appreciate her for incorporating it into her books because then I get to learn through that. But yeah, I definitely loved that book, definitely recommend it. I'm excited to dive into the sequels. I would look up trigger warnings if you're gonna read this, if you haven't already. I usually dive in without looking up trigger warnings, which is my choice, but then I'm like, I should have looked up the trigger warnings. I was not ready, I was not prepared, but very much enjoyed it. That was a really good way to end the month, and yeah, this was a pretty solid month of reading. There were really good ones and then some kind of more in the middle, but there were no duds. There was none that I absolutely hated or anything like that. So yeah, just a solid month of reading, and I'm excited for some more summer books. The weather is getting hotter, which always puts me in one of two moods, either like a romance mood or just like in a dark horror mood. So yeah, those are my two summer moods, and I'm excited to read some books in those categories coming up. Yeah, thanks for being here. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment below if you have read any of these or if they sound like books that you're interested in picking up. And let me know what you've been reading lately. Have you read anything that fits into that summer vibe of either romance or just really dark, ugly summer horror that you recommend for me to pick up soon? I would love to hear your recommendations. But anyway, I'll wrap up with that. I'll let you go because it is getting darker and darker, and I feel like I've been yapping for a minute. So I'll catch you in the next one. Bye, amigues.